Story 1: The Dark Beach Night. I never thought that a simple night at the beach could turn into what I'm about to share. It was supposed to be just a laid-back outing, a chance to finally get closer to Amanda, the girl I had been harboring feelings for over the past few months. Our group of friends always did this kind of thing, going out without much of a plan, just to enjoy the moment. But that night was different. We decided to head to the beach, which seemed like a good idea at the time. The air was warm and humid, creating the perfect atmosphere for a pleasant evening by the sea. The moon was partially obscured by thick clouds, and the sound of the waves crashing in the distance was the only noise filling the quiet night. Amanda was as radiant as ever, and I was determined to use this opportunity to finally talk to her, to let her know how I felt. We arrived at the beach around 10 at night. There was no one else there, which was odd for that time of year. Usually, there were a few couples or small groups scattered across the sand, but at that moment, we were the only ones there. This didn't seem to bother anyone in the group. In fact, the idea of having the beach all to ourselves was actually kind of appealing. We sat in a circle with a makeshift bonfire in the middle. Laughter and conversations flowed naturally, and for a moment, everything seemed perfect. But then, something started to bother me. I can't say exactly what it was, but I felt a presence, something I couldn't see but that was there, watching us. I looked out at the sea, but all I could see was the pale reflection of the moon on the dark water. I decided to ignore that feeling and focus on Amanda, who was sitting beside me. We talked about trivial things, like school and our plans for the future. I was beginning to feel like that night might be the one where something would finally change between us. But then, I noticed she was also uneasy, looking out at the sea with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Amanda, is everything okay?" I asked, trying not to sound too concerned. She hesitated before answering, which only heightened my anxiety. I think I saw something out there in the water," she said, pointing towards the sea. I followed her gaze but couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. "It's probably just the moon's reflection," I tried to reassure her, but the truth was, that strange feeling returned to bother me. The others started to notice something different too. Jonas, who was the most skeptical of us all, suddenly stood up and began walking towards the water. "I'm going to check it out," he said, as if he wanted to prove to himself that nothing was wrong. We watched as he approached the water's edge. The moonlight illuminated the wet sand, but as Jonas got closer to the water, something seemed different. He stopped suddenly and stood there, staring intently at the sea. "What do you see?" someone asked, but Jonas didn't respond immediately. When he finally returned to the group, he was pale, and his eyes reflected a fear I had never seen in him before. There's something out there," he murmured, his voice trembling. "I don't know what it is, but it's watching us." A tense silence fell over the group. What had been a night full of laughter and relaxation was now filled with palpable tension. I looked at the sea again, and this time, I was certain there was something there. A figure, dark, indistinct, like a shadow floating on the water. It was far away, but it seemed to be getting closer. "Let's go," Anna, Jonas's sister, suggested. "This is starting to get creepy." But for some reason, no one moved. It was as if that presence had a hypnotic power over us, keeping us there, trapped in a cycle of fear and curiosity. Amanda moved closer to me and grabbed my arm. "We shouldn't have come here," she whispered. I wanted to respond, to reassure her, but the words stuck in my throat. All I could do was stare at the figure that was now clearly visible to everyone. And then, it started to move. It was slow, almost imperceptible, but it was definitely coming closer. The water around it seemed to move in a strange way, as if being manipulated by some invisible force. Jonas took a step back, and that's when we heard a sound I'll never forget. A deep, guttural sound, as if coming from the very earth itself. That was enough to break the trance we were in. "Run!" someone shouted, and without a second thought, we all took off sprinting across the sand. The sound of our footsteps mixed with the sound of the waves, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. Amanda was running beside me, and I made sure not to lose sight of her. Fear was driving us forward, but with every step, I felt like that thing was getting closer. Finally, we reached the parking lot where our cars were. Everyone got into their vehicles as quickly as possible, and soon we were speeding away from that cursed place. No one said a word on the drive back. The silence in the car was almost as terrifying as what we had just witnessed. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see that dark figure following us, but there was nothing. Just the darkness of the road. When we finally stopped in front of Amanda's house, she was still trembling. "Did you see that?" she asked, as if she still doubted what had happened. I nodded, still speechless. What could I say? There was no logical explanation for what we saw that night. I said goodbye to her, and as I watched her walk into her house, I couldn't stop thinking about what had followed us. Was it really there? Or was it just a trick of our collective imagination? That night, I tried to sleep, but the images of that dark figure haunted me every time I closed my eyes. When I finally fell asleep, I had nightmares about the sea, about that terrible sound, and about the feeling of being watched. The days that followed were strange. We tried to act as if nothing had happened, but we all knew something had changed. Jonas stopped talking about the incident and avoided the subject whenever someone brought it up. Amanda and I drifted apart, not because we wanted to, but because we simply couldn't face what had happened. The fear was always there, in every look, in every uncomfortable silence. Then, one night, a few days later, I got a message from Jonas. "We need to talk," it said. Reluctantly, I went to his house, where I found him sitting on the porch, looking more worn out than ever. "I went back," he said bluntly. "I went back to the beach." I was shocked. "Are you crazy?" "Why?" He looked me in the eyes, and at that moment, I realized that something inside him had broken. I needed to know. I needed to be sure we weren't all going insane that night. "What did you see?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He hesitated before answering, and what he said took my breath away. "Nothing." There was nothing there. Jonas tried to explain that he stayed at the beach for hours, waiting for the figure to appear again, but all he found was a calm, silent sea. It was as if the experience of that night had been just a delusion, a collective hallucination. But I knew, and so did he, that this wasn't true. Something was there, watching us, and for some reason, it decided to leave us alone. At least for now. Life went on, but the memory of that night never left me. To this day, I find myself thinking about that moment, trying to understand what really happened. And whenever I pass by a beach at night, I feel a shiver down my spine, as if that figure is there, waiting for me. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget, but what I do know is that, in some way, all of us changed after that night. Something inside us was ripped out, replaced by a shadow, a darkness that will never fully go away. And the worst part is the feeling that it's still out there somewhere, waiting for the right moment to appear again. Story 2: The Mystery of the Boat at Sunset. Growing up near the beach had its perks. My sisters and I spent most of our afternoons there, running along the sand, building castles, and diving into the waves. But there was something special about the sunset. When the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the beach transformed into a place that felt almost magical. It was our refuge, a time just for us, far from the responsibilities and worries of the world. It was on one of those peaceful afternoons that began so ordinarily, yet ended in a way we would never forget. I was with my two sisters, Clara and Julia. Clara was the eldest, always responsible and attentive to everything. Julia, the youngest, was only 7, but she was the most curious and adventurous of us all. She loved to run along the shore, challenging the waves as if they were giants to be conquered. We were playing at the water's edge, letting the waves lap at our feet. Julia, as always, had strayed a bit further from us, laughing and jumping, trying to escape the waves. Clara and I kept an eye on her, watching her closely but also trusting that she knew how to take care of herself. Time seemed to pass slowly, and everything was at peace. The sound of the waves, the rustling of palm leaves in the breeze, the smell of the sea. It was the perfect scene. Until suddenly, I realized that Julia was no longer where we had last seen her. "Clara, where's Julia?" I asked, trying to hide the growing concern in my voice. Clara looked around, frowning. "She was just there a moment ago," she replied, but her tone betrayed that she was also starting to feel uneasy. We began calling out for Julia, our voices mingling with the sound of the sea, but there was no response. I looked toward the horizon and saw a small boat, not far from the shore, gently bobbing with the waves. The boat appeared to be a simple vessel, but what caught my attention was the fact that there were 2 people on board. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but something about that scene made me uncomfortable. "Clara, look over there," I said, pointing to the boat. She followed my gaze and, upon seeing the boat, her face turned pale. Do you think she went out there?" she suggested, the uncertainty in her voice mirroring my own. Without a second thought, we began running toward the boat. With every step we took, the fear grew. What could Julia be doing on a boat with strangers? How had she gotten there? These questions pounded in my mind, but I had no time to dwell on them. I could only focus on reaching her, on making sure she was okay. By the time we reached the water's edge, it was almost dark. The colors of the sunset had begun to dissolve into deep shades of blue, and the beach, once welcoming, now felt cold and ominous. The boat was closer than before, and with a brief moment of relief, I saw Julia sitting on the edge, swinging her legs as if she were completely at ease. "Julia!" I shouted, my voice trembling from both the effort and the fear. She looked at us, smiling. "Look, they gave me food," she said, holding something that looked like a sandwich. Hearing that, my heart nearly stopped. Who were these people, and why were they giving food to my sister? I moved closer to the water, until the tide touched my feet, and then I saw the 2 men who were with her. I couldn't immediately spot anything threatening about them, but there was something that didn't feel right. "Come back here, Julia," Clara yelled, her voice full of urgency. "Now." She hesitated, looking at the men as if seeking their permission. This only heightened my desperation. Why was she acting as if they had some sort of control over her? One of the men approached the edge of the boat and looked at us. "It's all right," he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We were just looking after her until you got here." Something in the way he spoke made my blood run cold. Clara and I exchanged a glance, and without needing to say anything, we knew we had to get Julia out of there as quickly as possible. "Julia, come back here now," I repeated, trying to keep calm, but my voice betrayed the panic I felt. After what felt like an eternity, she finally started to stand up. The man closest to her held her hand to help her down from the boat, and the mere sight of that almost made me run over there and pull her away by force. When she stepped into the water and began walking towards us, I felt such immense relief that I nearly fell to my knees. But that relief was quickly replaced by a sense of imminent danger. The men on the boat continued to watch us, saying nothing more. They made no move to leave, which only deepened my suspicion. I grabbed Julia's hand as soon as she was close enough and began leading her back to the beach, with Clara by our side. "Why did you go out there, Julia? Who are those men?" I asked, trying not to sound accusatory but failing miserably. "I was just playing in the water," she replied, innocently. "They called me and said they had food. I was hungry, so I went to see." Hearing this sent a chill down my spine. Who were these people? Why were they offering food to a child alone in the sea? The questions piled up in my mind, but my fear for Julia kept me from thinking clearly. All I wanted was to get out of there, to take her somewhere safe. When we finally got far enough from the boat, I looked back. The men were still there, watching us. I felt a wave of relief to see that they weren't trying to follow us, but their gaze, fixed on us, was something I'll never forget. It was as if they were marking our faces, our actions, for something that was yet to come. We returned home without saying a word, but the silence was heavy with tension. When we arrived, our father was on the porch, waiting for us. He always gave us a bit more freedom in the summer, But it was clear that night, he had sensed something was wrong. "You're late," he said, not taking his eyes off us. "What happened?" Clara and I exchanged looks, not knowing exactly where to start. "Julia went onto a boat," I began, my voice sounding weak even to my own ears. "There were 2 men there, and they were giving her food." Our father went pale. "What? Who were these men?" he asked, his voice now full of concern. "We don't know," Clara answered, still holding Julia's hand. "They said they were just looking after her, but something was off," I added. Our father made us describe everything in detail, each word increasing his tension. After listening to us, he fell silent for a moment, absorbing what we had said. Then, in a sudden movement, he grabbed the phone and began making calls, trying to find out if anyone else had seen the boat or the men. But no one seemed to know anything. That night, he forbade us from going back to the beach after sunset. He didn't explain his reasons, but he didn't need to. We all knew that something was wrong, that those men shouldn't have been there, and that Julia was very lucky to have made it home safely. The following weeks were tense. I avoided looking at the sea whenever I passed by it, as if fearing that the men were still there, waiting. Julia, despite her innocence, seemed to have picked up on our fear because she stopped asking to go to the beach at nightfall. Instead, she stayed close to us, always looking over her shoulder as if expecting something or someone to suddenly appear. For a while, I tried to forget what had happened, but the images of that afternoon continued to haunt me. The expressions of those men, the way they watched us without making any move to leave. There was something deeply unsettling about all of it. Then, one night, I heard a noise coming from my bedroom window. It was a soft sound, like someone scratching the glass. My heart raced, and for a moment, I was paralyzed, unsure of what to do. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and slowly approached the window. I carefully drew back the curtain, but all I saw was darkness outside. There was no one there, but the sound continued, as if something were trying to get in. I quickly closed the curtain, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The next morning, I told Clara what had happened. She looked at me with concern, but she didn't seem surprised. "I heard something too," she said. I think they know where we are." Her calm tone only made my fear grow. If those men really knew where we were, what did they want from us? And why were they after us? The questions remained unanswered, and the feeling of danger became more and more real. After that night, things only got worse. We started noticing that small objects were disappearing from the house. Nothing of great value, but things we knew had been there and suddenly were no longer. Julia began having nightmares, waking up screaming in the middle of the night, saying that the men were trying to take her back to the boat. Our father tried to reassure us, saying that all of this was just a product of our imagination, but we knew it wasn't. Something was wrong, and no matter how much we tried to ignore it, the feeling that we were being watched never left us. We started avoiding the beach altogether, even during the day. The place that had once been our refuge now seemed dangerous, as if it were being watched. And the worst part was not knowing who those men were or what they really wanted. As time passed, things slowly returned to normal, but the fear never completely went away. To this day, whenever I go to the beach, I can't help but look out at the sea, expecting to see that boat again. And sometimes, when night falls and everything is silent, I still hear that sound, as if someone were trying to get in. Story 3: The Intruder at the Beach House. The beach house had always been our refuge, a place to escape the chaos of the city and recharge. My girlfriend, Sarah, and I loved spending a few days there, especially during the winter when the beach was deserted, and the atmosphere was even more serene. That year, we decided to take advantage of a long weekend to relax and enjoy the tranquility of the sea. We arrived at the beach house on a cloudy afternoon, the gray sky matching the chill that was beginning to set in. Unlike in the summer, when the place was full of life and vibrant colors, winter gave the beach a melancholic, almost mysterious air. It was the kind of environment that always drew me in, perhaps because of the silence and solitude it provided. We parked the car in the garage and carried our bags inside. The house was exactly as we had left it the last time, cozy, with that familiar smell of aged wood and sea salt. Sarah, as usual, went straight to the living room, where she lit the fireplace and snuggled up on the sofa with a blanket. I, on the other hand, headed to the kitchen to make something warm for us. While the kettle heated, I stood by the window, admiring the waves crashing on the deserted beach. After a while, Sarah suggested we take a walk along the beach before it got completely dark. I agreed, and soon we were walking side by side, feeling the cold wind cutting across our faces. The sound of the waves was the only sound accompanying us, creating an almost surreal setting. There was no one else around, and the feeling of being completely isolated was both comforting and unsettling. We talked about trivial things, work, our plans for the future, but there was something in the air, a feeling I couldn't quite identify. It was as if we were being watched, even though I knew that was impossible. I tried to push this feeling aside, attributing it to my overactive imagination, but it kept bothering me. As the sun began to disappear on the horizon, we decided to head back to the house. The temperature had dropped even further, and all we wanted was to warm up by the fireplace, maybe watch a movie, and relax before bed. However, as we approached the house, something caught my attention. The front door was slightly ajar. "Didn't you close the door?" I asked Sarah, trying to keep my voice calm, though a hint of anxiety was beginning to grow inside me. She frowned, clearly confused. "I'm sure I closed it," she replied, looking at the door with the same concern I was feeling. My instinct was to investigate immediately. Pushing the door open cautiously, I stepped inside the house, trying not to make a sound. Sarah followed close behind, her hand clutching mine as I scanned each room with my eyes. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling that something was wrong was undeniable. Maybe it was the wind, Sarah suggested, but her tone indicated she didn't really believe that possibility. I checked each room, every corner of the house, but there was no sign of anyone. Everything seemed normal, and yet, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. We closed the door and made sure to lock all the windows. We tried to return to normal, but something had changed. The once cozy atmosphere now felt charged with invisible tension. Night fell quickly, bringing with it a storm that swept through the area. The wind howled fiercely, making the windows rattle and the house creak ominously. The rain pounded on the roof as if trying to break in, and the sound of the waves, once gentle and relaxing, now seemed threatening. We tried to distract ourselves by watching a movie, but it was hard to ignore the noise outside. With every clap of thunder, Sarah shrank a little more into the sofa, and I could feel the tension affecting us both. When the movie ended, we decided to go to bed, hoping that sleep would bring some relief. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the storm outside, while my mind wandered through increasingly disturbing scenarios. Sarah, beside me, was also restless, tossing and turning and sighing from time to time. Then, I heard a different sound. A low noise, almost imperceptible, but it stood out amidst the storm. It seemed to be coming from downstairs, from the living room. I held my breath, trying to listen more closely, and the sound repeated. It was a slow dragging noise, as if something heavy was being moved. My heart raced. Could someone have really entered the house? My mind filled with terrifying images, but I tried to stay rational. Maybe it was just the wind, or something that had fallen, but I knew I had to check. I got up carefully, trying not to make any noise, and signaled to Sarah, who looked at me with wide eyes. "Stay here," I whispered, trying to sound more confident than I actually was. With light steps, I descended the stairs, each step creaking ominously under my weight. The house was shrouded in darkness, and the only sound I could hear was the incessant rain beating against the windows. When I reached the last step, I stopped, listening intently. The sound had stopped. The living room was empty, or at least it seemed to be. I walked slowly to the kitchen, where the kettle still sat on the stove, now cold. Everything was in its place, and yet, that feeling that something was off wouldn't leave me. A shiver ran down my spine, but I tried to ignore it. While I stood there in the middle of the darkness, something caught my attention. One of the chairs at the dining table was slightly pulled out, something I knew I hadn't done. I approached it, hesitant, and that's when I saw it. On the floor near the chair were drag marks. They were faint but visible. Something or someone had moved that chair, and it wasn't me. My heart began to race, and panic started to set in. I quickly returned upstairs, where Sarah was waiting for me with a fearful expression on her face. "What is it?" she asked, seeing the look on my face. "There's someone here," I said, trying to stay calm. "Someone moved the chair." There was no need for further explanation. Sarah grabbed my arm, and we both stood in silence, straining to hear any other sounds that might confirm my suspicion. But everything was quiet. The storm outside seemed to have calmed, and the house was enveloped in an almost suffocating silence. I knew we couldn't just ignore this. Something was wrong, and we needed to find out what it was. I grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand drawer and began to descend the stairs again, this time with Sarah following close behind. If someone was in the house, we couldn't stay hidden in the bedroom, waiting for something bad to happen. The sound of our footsteps was muffled by the carpet on the lower floor, and the darkness seemed more oppressive than before. Every shadow, every dark corner seemed to hide an imminent danger, and my mind was racing, trying to anticipate what might happen. When we reached the living room again, I turned on the flashlight and swept the beam of light across the room. Nothing. The chair was in the same place, and there was no sign of anyone. The feeling of being watched was still there, but there was nothing to explain it. Sarah was trembling, and I didn't know what to say to reassure her. Something was definitely wrong, but I couldn't figure out what. Then, I heard the sound again. This time, it came from the bedroom. My blood ran cold. The bedroom? How could someone have gotten past us without us noticing? I exchanged a glance with Sarah, and I saw the fear in her eyes. But we had no choice. We had to check. We climbed the stairs again, carefully, and each step felt like an eternity. The sound had stopped as soon as we started moving, but I knew that whatever it was waiting for us upstairs. When we finally reached the top of the stairs, I paused, trying to listen for anything that might indicate where the intruder was. I slowly opened the bedroom door, the flashlight beam sweeping the room. Nothing seemed out of place. The bed was made, the curtains drawn. But the fear continued to torment me. Then, something caught my eye. A small wrinkle in the blanket, near the foot of the bed. I approached it cautiously, trying to ignore the sound of my heart pounding so hard it seemed to echo through the house. I slowly bent down, until my head was close enough to see under the bed. And that's when I saw it. A face, pale and expressionless, staring directly at me. For a moment, the shock paralyzed me, and terror took hold of me. The intruder was there, hiding under our bed, as if waiting for the right moment to act. Backing away seemed impossible, but somehow, I managed. I grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her out of the room. There was no time to think, only to act. We ran down the stairs without looking back and rushed out the front door, getting into the car in a frenzy. I didn't stop driving until we were miles away from the house. Only then, with the safety of the city lights around us, did I begin to process what had happened. The intruder, that pale face under the bed. Nothing had been stolen, nothing had been moved besides that chair, but the sense of threat was undeniable. We never went back to that house. The place that once brought us so much comfort and peace became a dark memory, a reminder that sometimes, true terror hides in the most unexpected places. And to this day, when I think about that night, the image of that pale face under the bed still haunts me. I keep wondering what he really wanted, and why he did nothing when he had the chance. Whatever it was, I'm grateful we escaped unharmed, but the fear that it might still be there, waiting for us, has never completely gone away.